so we're finishing up, and Carlos, I think we're just about had enough with him. If you were going to talk about that in the exam, obviously, you want to master some of the religious ideas of brujos and having a teacher, if you like, and a guide, and the sort of aids that may happen, and maybe you want to compare a little bit to the movie. I haven't thought about the exam yet, so frankly I don't know what to tell you yet about that. But really, since Noelle's the one you're going to run it by, and she loves Long Beach State, it says there.
It's Beach Pride Day.
Yeah, it's Beach Pride Day.
So if you go out at LH 151 between 12 and 2, we'll have some free stuff to give away.
I think what's you're on some kind of council, aren't you? What are you on?
Associated Students.
You're Associated Students. What?
Incorporated. I'm a senator.
You're a senator. And are there congressmen or just senators?
There are senators, and then we have the executive board.
This is a bit too soon to pass that around, I think, because half the students aren't here yet. Wait. Well, hang on to it. Hang on to that, okay, for about 10 minutes, then start it.
But I have to go.
Oh, you have to go?
I'll be back at the end of class.
All right, see you at the end of time. So anyway, so you're a senator, and there are congressmen?
There are presidents to each college.
I see.
Where
do you guys meet? Do you have a?
Yeah, we have a Senate chamber.
You have a Senate building?
In the student union, yeah.
Wow, I tell you, this is a real democracy. Thanks a lot.
Sure.
I have little enough confidence in the national government. I hope that the university government is a little more confident. But I have grave doubts on all governments being basically an anarchist who doesn't like anarchism. So, I think we're all in the same boat as where that goes. I don't think anyone has a successful answer to government. I guess the best statement is the corniest one that you probably have all heard. Democracy is the worst form of government, even though this isn't really democracy that we're in, but it's an attempt to approximate democracy, except for all the others. Anything you could think of, unfortunately, would be worse. I was recently watching some stuff about Stalin and people like that, who supposedly represented socialism in quotes in the early part of the last century. And how all those people could have been taken in by such brutality and murderous maniacs. You wonder about people's minds. There's huge swaths of intellectuals, left-leaning, well-meaning people who, really, thought something decent was going on, and they were like totally taking the cleaners. It's just mind-boggling, the sorts of things that go on that are supposed to represent something better. So even though ours is not ideal, I would grant you, and I was, when your age, one of the biggest cynics going, I still think that statement is the best form. It's the worst form except for all the others, which are worse. So when you come up with a better one, let us see it. We'll be happy to try it out, perhaps. On the university campus, anyway. Anyway, so as far as the test goes, there'll be some essays, 2 out of 3. And there'll be a few short identifications just to keep you on your toes. Make sure you've been reading this stuff, and not multiple choice. Again, I've always said to people who are used to taking college boards and intelligence tests and so on, those are all well and good for machine marking purposes, because they don't want humans to mark those things. It's too much effort. But nobody ever gave you multiple choice questions in life except on a quiz program. Life has nothing to do with multiple choice answers in terms of what you do in life. Maybe in terms of where you're going and your destiny. You say, should I take this road? Should I take that road? Should I take a third road? That might be multiple choice, and they're all equally seemingly okay. So that really isn't. There is no right answer in the multiple choices in life. But the rest of life, you have to produce something from your brain. You have to put out something. You have to either write something, say something, something positive from you. And nothing is passive knowledge. So these tests are really pretty silly, the ones that are being marked. And the only reason people do them is because they're lazy. They just don't want to read them. And one of the reasons, again, I'm just walking here while people come in, but one of the reasons people can't read and write well is because teachers along the line, and I don't blame them, they have a huge load. I'm not complaining about teachers. I would hate to do what teachers in secondary schools, grammar schools, middle schools have to do. The number of classes that they teach, the number of papers they have to mark. It's really grueling work, and they don't get paid anywhere near the effort that they put in. So I'm not complaining about what they do. However, the reason people really don't read and write well is that nobody is looking at their work. Nobody is telling them this sentence isn't any good. You've expressed yourself in a clumsy way here. You're using the wrong word here. Your grammar is poor here. You don't know how to construct the English language here. Nobody's taking that time. You know why no one's taking time? It takes huge effort for someone marking a paper to make all those comments on 30 papers in 6 different class levels every week or two. I mean, a person would be going mad. So that's one of the big problems. So that's why they give you multiple choice. And that's why they use the university to give you these kinds of things in these 3 classes. But we have Noelle, and fortunately she's willing to, go through them. You say, why don't you do it? Well, if I did it, I'd probably have gone mad a long time ago, even though I'm already half mad. So I do it on the smaller classes. But she does it for this one, and she's pretty well compensated, so you don't have to feel sorry for her. She's not being taken advantage of, I can assure you. I don't know if it's sufficient to teach a person to write. It takes a lot of effort. Anyway, so the exams will be a few essays because we feel that's the best way to do things. And there is no right answer. So you say, well, what should I? You just study the best thing you think you can express yourself on and then put it on the paper. And if it's impressive anyway, it'll impress the reader, just like it impresses you. That's the way to do an essay. There may be a few right answers, but basically you're just putting some ideas down that you have. So the more interesting and colorful and forceful the ideas that you have, the better impression it makes on the reader. Put yourself in the reader's position. Suppose you were reading 100 tests. How would you mark it? So you're going to mark the ones that make an impression on you highest, and the ones that have fewest sloppy errors. So if you get a paper and it's like first illegible, second unreadable, third incomprehensible, well obviously you're not going to give that the highest grade, even though the person who wrote it may be a genius. You say, well, I knew all the stuff, I just couldn't express it. Well, okay, there is the problem. You can know all kinds of things, but if you can't get it out, you're going to be a little bit down the ladder in some way. So the answer to what you should do, get your ideas together, see how you're going to express them, feel that you've got something to say on these subjects and get it in your mind and come in here and be able to write about it in an hour or so here. That's the best way. The short answers are 5 or 6 things, just knock them off the top of your head. I already know them before you go, even no sense running around looking for them. And just so people think that they don't have to, that they don't worry about forgetting anything, you can bring your books in the class. And you can bring 5 or 10 note cards with little notes. I don't want to bring all your notes because then people start, making too much noise, flipping over all their papers, looking for some lost idea buried in the 10th page of their note taking or something. Just get the important stuff on little cards, bring them in. You won't forget anything then. And you're fine. You shouldn't get any nerves in that case. Then you can just relax and write something interesting. That's, to me, the best way to do it. Also, it avoids the problem, am I cheating or am I not cheating? Yeah, cheat all you want. Just don't cheat off your neighbor's stuff. Cheat on your own stuff. So there's no problem then where that that because I hate being a warden for people's moral issues. Okay, so this Bhagavad Gita that we're looking at now is really a representation of this yoga phenomenon that swept the country 30 or 40 years ago and is still, to a certain extent, in progress. So I think Madonna's Kabbalah movement is overtaking it among the yuppie elite. These things go in waves of fads, if you like. I even hear that Britney Spears is going Kabbalah now. So, it's maybe yoga is on the way out in America. I don't know. So you'll have to judge that yourself. But I think it's still pretty strong among certain groups and as an exercise, as an attempt to get rid of anxiety, as a way of calming down, as a way of focusing your energies and things like that. So I think it's still pretty strong. And this was supposed to be the handbook of it. But as you read this book, I think you'll see that it really isn't teaching you a lot about yoga as such. I mean, you would need a guru or someone probably to teach you, which is the name of a teacher of yoga. You would need a guru or someone like that probably to give his or her own method. Each of them had different methods. So when yoga really was in fruition, you get people who could twist their, part of it was to show how masterful you were. They could twist their leg around their neck or something, or could make their stomach go in and out, or could, I don't know. There's a guy now, I think there's a guy crawling to the Pakistan border or something across India, or rolling. I think he's rolling. He's rolling. The guy rolling to the border. He's been rolling for like 2 years. There's all kinds of ways to show. Or like people would stick, nails in themselves, or run on beds of hot coals. I mean, actually, you could probably run on a bed of hot coals even without yoga, as long as you get your mind focused and go fast enough and keep your legs moving pretty quickly. It's like going on some hot sand in the beach in a way. It's a little hotter maybe. If you don't keep the feet down for any length of time, you probably won't get too burned. And if your feet have become a little bit calloused related to, you probably wouldn't have too much trouble. But you want to keep your feet moving. I don't think any of those hot coal runners ever like stand still in the middle of the fire. So these are like some kinds of tricks and breathing tricks and so on. So, but those take different teachers. So this is a handbook, and it's around the 3rd century and 2nd century BC. And as I told you last time, I've always suspected some possible, because there's many Christians who like, or for a time anyway, like this Krishna consciousness. It always seemed to me that those two words were a little too close together in terms of the sound and the spelling for comfort, and that you say, well, what happened? I don't know what happened, but I think ideas were moving westward from the east. And I don't say just the Christ, that the Krishna idea moved into the Christ idea, though, but I think the Buddha and the Krishna idea probably moved into the Christ idea. Because the Christ idea is not a Palestinian idea. The Christ idea, as we have it in Christian practice and religion primarily, developed in Paul's writings. That's where you really see it. The Gospels are an attempt to historicize things, make it look like this happened in history. Whether it happened in history or not would depend on how cynical the person reading them was. When I was young, I believed everything I read in the Gospels. When I'm older now, I don't believe very much of it. It's just a matter of youth and experience. When you're young, you believe everything people tell you. when you get older. As Paul said, when I was a child, I saw as a child. When I was a man, I grew up and put away childish things. A lot of people are children their whole lives. So you say, well, how come my parents are still doing this? Well, many people are childlike. Sometimes when I look at myself in the mirror and talk to myself, so I may look a certain age, I feel like I'm 15. I don't feel like I'm an aged person. And you know, it's only that other way others see you. In your mind, you're just a kid still. And you never do grow up, actually. What, am I old yet? Am I old? Am I supposed to be old? And only because other people are telling you that they're calling you dad or granddad or whatever, then you're supposed to be old. But actually, when you're just communing with yourself, you're just a kid. And you never are old. You still got parents, you still got mom and dad, you still got all this other stuff. And the fact you have other accoutrements really don't have great effect. So what I'm trying to say is that when you're young, often these things are more puzzling to you than when you get older. And when you get older, since you've never seen these things in your lifetime, you begin to set them aside a little bit and worry about it. So, as I said, the Gospels I thought were totally true when I was young, and now I have more doubts, but I don't expect you to follow what I think. But the point is that the original writings of Christianity are in people like Paul. They came before the Gospels, and those writings look a lot like things from further east. They don't look Palestinian at all in the sense of the kind of ideas that he's promoting, because in Palestine you didn't have an idea of a supernatural being who could do miraculous things. That's already a yoga type thing and a Buddha type thing. And the Christ as a concept that comes onto someone in the form of a dove. There's nothing in previous Old Testament literature that even remotely resembles or anticipates that. So anyhow, I don't want to get too deep into it, but you say, how could the influences occur? Well, we're going to have a spate of movies coming on now about Alexander the Great. There's at least 2 movies coming online about Alexander the Great. How far east did Alexander get?
India.
He got to India. With armies, with big armies. He conquered swaths of territory. He didn't even have to get as far as India. He could have just got to Persia, and these ideas were already coming into through Persia. You had lots of Buddhist and other ideas coming into Persia, Iran as we now call it, and so on. But he met yogis, swamis, whatever you want to call these religious practitioners, not just him, but he had groups of philosophers and scientists with him, just like Napoleon later had when he went to Egypt. But not just him. Plato, who's earlier than him, a century earlier, philosophers of that kind speak of the Eastern philosophers. They've met, they know about it. So these kind of currents of thinking are constantly moving east to west. You say, well, is there anything going west to east? Not a lot. Now it is. Now we're setting all our ideas all over the world. But at that time, there was very little except conquering armies like Alexander going west to east. After a time, Christianity bounced back and started going east again. But it never really made huge progress in the east, did it? It sort of managed to get to India in certain forms, but in a very slim manner. Never made big inroads past, let's say, Asia Minor or Palestine proper. It never did go that way. Everything came this way for some unknown reason. So the Krishna thing, to my mind, is very close to the Christ thing in the terms that you have a man God. He's a spiritual person. He's a physical person. He's got a similar name. You know, talk about anagrams. Basically, the only difference is a T in there rather than an N. And S and SH are basically the same letters in Middle Eastern. So, you know, you're very close. And he's a teacher. And he's a God at the same time, and he doesn't seem to die, and things like that. Krishna doesn't die either. Why? I mean, he doesn't go to heaven. That's a Western concept, heaven. probably from the Greek gods who are up in heaven. But other than that, both are immortal in the sense that Christ even gets executed, but he doesn't die. He comes back from the dead, if you like. Then they go somewhere else where it's hard to imagine, and the Krishna goes someplace else because he achieves Krishna consciousness, if you will. He gets enlightenment, pure enlightenment. He becomes totally spiritual. The Jesus thing is a little more complicated, but it's not dealt with in the documents, because the historical documents have Jesus walking around with his apostles in the beginning of the book of Acts, and then somehow he evaporates or goes. Why he comes back just to go back to heaven again is a little bit confusing to me. But I mean, he's got resurrected, he's achieved that thing, and then the first thing he does is leave again. So it's a bit confusing. Why didn't he just stay here forever? Why do you have to go up to heaven again? All that trouble to get back here. Think about that. So you say, well, what do you mean? I said, well, the literary people who write these things, you have to understand, these may or may not be historical events. If you're a believer, they are. But there's always human beings in the middle of this writing this thing. And human beings, as you know, always mess around with plots. We live in Hollywood, which is the center of plots. They just spin plots off endlessly. I just saw that movie Troy, and you wouldn't have recognized the Iliad in that movie. The scriptwriters got a hold of it, and wow, it was like something entirely you had. As I think I told you, a woman with a bow and arrow, who was the heroine, and I can't even tell you the number of things that were not in Homer in that movie. And it was supposed to be a takeoff. A really disappointing movie, because if they had followed Homer, it had a much better plot. But when the scriptwriters get on to something, and then they rewrite things. You take one plot and they give it to a new scriptwriter 20 years later, and he's already or she's already changed it into something else. So scriptwriters are really terrible people in the sense that they can do anything with historical material that they want. The King Arthur legends, I think we recently had a lot of feminist King Arthur movies. I mean, at one point, King Arthur, did such and such things. Now, Guinevere is a bow woman, and, this is to appeal to the so-called woman's lib side of things. So they just spin it in a different way. You say, you mean people spin things? Well, according to Bill O'Reilly, that's all people do is spin things. So the question is there spin going on in ancient times? Yeah, there is spin going on in ancient times, unfortunately. But we don't really realize that. We think that what we do in the modern time, the ancients were innocent of. In fact, it's the opposite. The ancients did it as much or more than we did. And we're just not familiar with ancient history, so we just don't know these things. I don't want to go any further than that, but it's just my lecture on why I think the Krishna thing appeals so much to many Christians. What is the difference that appeals to people who are born Christian and looking for something else, but they don't want to go very far? Well, the Krishna and the Buddha thing are very appealing to people, particularly in Catholic faith for some reason. I don't know why Protestants seem to have less of an attraction. Buddhism is a very strong appeal to Catholic intellectuals. And again, I don't understand why that is. But what often they're looking for is a more personal religious experience, something that is not a ceremonial, something that doesn't have a sacraments that you participate in, but actually that you go through a personal process of enlightenment. But you still don't want to go far from the ideals that you have been taught, like turn the other cheek, pacifism, loving your neighbor, stuff like that. So you don't want to go into Islam, which gets a little bit too ferocious. So something a little bit quietist, pacifistic, and that's found in this Krishna and this Buddhism thing, and also a process of enlightenment. So both the religions, Buddhism and Krishna consciousness, which probably influence each other, are pre-Christian. So neither of them developed after Christianity, but rather before Christianity. So I think you can make connections, though I've never seen anyone do it in any sort of systematic fashion. Well, the literature that came first were the Vedas, as we said, which were sort of like a combination of priestly purity regulations, plus a certain amount of mythological insight. And the Upanishads continue that in another period of early Hindu history, which we're not dealing with here. And the last part of the literature is this poem that we have here, this Mahabharata. Now, in these previous literatures, we have the things like I was telling you about, Brahman, which is more or less of a God-like idea, the external God, the external infinity or timelessness, and the internal. They divided it into those two things. And they felt that once you found the internal one, you could move into the external one. Now, you know, to some extent, you need a teacher to tell you this. But he quotes in my introduction some of the Upanishads where some of these ideas are given. If we ask where is Brahman, the spirit of the universe, the answer is given in the Kina Upanishad. He is seen in nature in the wonder of a flash of lightning, comes to the soul in the wonder of a flash of vision. Then you get the strange relationship of Brahman to Atman. Brahman is all, Atman is Brahman. Atman the self has four conditions, blah, 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 blah. So basically, all of these things to some extent are pre-Bhagavad Gita in this previous literature, particularly in the Upanishads. In the times of the Veda, the Vedic times, if you like, were times of action. And of all human actions, the sacrifice of the gods was the most important. So the Vedas, which are pre-Upanishad type literature, deal with the sacrifices and also some of these other concepts, the priesthood and things of that kind. Okay, the Mahabharata. I can never spell it, so I have it here in the book. I'll put it here for you. Now that is sort of like a cycle of poems, like the Greek literature, Homer. In that sense, Homer may even be earlier than this Mahabharata. But it's really a civil war between different parties in the Indian culture sphere, but also represented as the struggle between spiritual forces, good and evil, and so on. It's got 18 books. And in the middle of this, we get this, what's called the Bhagavad Gita. And that's just part of the poem, but it's extracted. And what is it? It's a discussion, a philosophical discussion. And here I think actually the influence has gone west to east. With Alexander, the Greek literature coming into India, maybe even Homer coming into India, influencing these epics. Alexander comes in the 4th century. These things are written in about the 3rd century. And particularly the Bhagavad Gita has the form of a what? You who have taken philosophy. Platonic dialogue. How many are familiar with the Platonic dialogue? Anybody? 1. Who else? 2. 3. Well, any of you want to tell me what a Platonic dialogue looks like for the benefit of the rest of the class?
Asking questions.
Yeah, it's 2 people talking usually, sometimes 3 or 4. Something like this, right? In fact, this looks like a Platonic dialogue. And I have an idea that probably the two either influence each other back and forth. Plato was very influenced by Indian philosophical ideas. You know, Plato, the Greek philosopher that we base most of our Western intellectual beginnings on. I know you think this is all nonsense, but in fact, this is really the kind of thing, if you're a civilized person, that distinguishes you from being the tax collector, the garbage person, and the insurance agent. You know, You don't expect to go to your tax collector or your tax preparer, rather, or your insurance agent and start talking about Plato. But in fact, you know, more than any other thing that would make it look like you went to college would be, you know, something about Socrates and Plato. Because that is the basic ornament of the beginning of Western civilized thought. Now, we don't have to agree with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, but particularly Socrates and Plato, you know, make it look like you've become a little cultured. So I wouldn't put your nose up totally at this. It's worth at least being able to talk a little about it. Okay, what did Socrates live? He lived in the 400s BC. He took part in some of the wars in the Peloponnesian Peninsula between Athens and Sparta. He talks about one battle that he was in, I think around 450 BC or so. Maybe a little later, maybe 440 BC. And how he saved someone on the battlefield and so on and so forth. But the Greek citizens had to fight like we supposedly used to have to fight. You know, now we just pay people to fight for us now. But like the Civil War, you could fight your way out of the Civil War by paying someone to take your place. At the moment, we're paying people to do the fighting, but it looks like we may have to go back in to do it ourselves at some point pretty soon. But in Greece, you had to fight as a citizen. You were expected to bear your military responsibility. And Plato did, which Socrates did, which he felt quite honorable about, and always spoke about that. Then he developed a school of thinking. He was kind of like a gadfly in Athens. And he was executed openly around 404 BC. At the point that Athens was in a state of collapse, they blamed all their misery and collapse on people like Plato, people like Socrates. They thought that he had undermined the fabric of their society and sapped the will of their young people to, you know, be courageous and fight and stuff like that. But I don't think that is true at all. They were basically making excuses for themselves, but they had become totally corrupt by this time. And if anyone was representing the strength of the society, people like Socrates were. So he was executed as a kind of like a scapegoat. Like I like to tell my classes that if there was no Socrates, you wouldn't have the story of Jesus. Socrates is a pre-Jesus character. He's just not presented as a supernatural being. But it is the story of the just man done to death by an unjust society, and everybody in the Western world knew it. Socrates how does he die? He's forced to do what? Hemlock, drink hemlock. Yeah. Thank you. And he does it willingly, does it just like Jesus in the Gospel. He's quite happy to meet his fate. He thinks it's important that he face up to that. If that's what the society wants to do to him, he's quite willing to accept that because he's a member of the society and so on. He's not going to run away, and he's not going to avoid, let their punishment fall upon them in the end. He's going to do what they voted that he should do. So there's some dialogues about that. Who wrote the dialogues? Plato. So who's Plato? He's one of Socrates' students. And he put all his own ideas, and presumably some of Socrates, in these series of dialogues that he wrote. So he wrote about the master, and he used Socrates the way the New Testament uses Jesus, as the kind of master teacher. And so this literature is pretty familiar to people at that time, but not in ours. We're used to, reading Rolling Stone or something. We don't have a literature anymore that's widespread in our society. Except in the schools, when people go to school, they occasionally read. They always seem to read Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter. That seems to be inflicted on everybody. So I don't understand what's any good about that book, why they should inflict it on. But they still don't understand. They don't have anything else to inflict upon people, so they inflict that on them. It's a totally, as far as I can see, useless book. Hemingway's a little better. So people get a little bit of Hemingway and stuff, but So what should they read? Well, that's a good question. I think I would start with Plato and Socrates, actually, and develop a curriculum that would be useful to students, not some of the stuff that seems to be. Yeah.
In those dialogues that Plato made, though, whose ideas tend to always come to the top?
Oh, Socrates or Plato, depending on who you think, if there's the same or different. Plato says we're both the same. Plato's ideas always win. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a spin there, right? Well, so the point is that he wrote these things in the form of a dialogue, and they have conversations about interesting philosophical issues. That's the beginning of Western philosophy. And it's always a different kind of subject, that, like you say, or who always wins? Well, Socrates always wins. But you see, it's the basis today. We call what they were doing dialectic. I don't know why it's called that, but that's what it's called. This argument back and forth. And it's the basis today of what people do in legal training. People in legal training go to law schools and basically read Socrates and Plato. You know, they learn how to argue a subject through question and answer in a courtroom situation. And what lawyers are doing in courtrooms is really what Socrates and Plato are presented as doing in these dialogues. So you see, this is not something that you should not look at. In fact, I used to read Socrates in this class, but I couldn't find an excuse for it. Instead of the Carlos Castaneda junk. But yeah, I found that students actually could relate more to the Carlos Castaneda stuff than the Socrates stuff. I was going to call it American civil religion, which I think is basically the intellectuals' religion, which I think it is in a way. But anyway, what you go to law school, what you learn is Socrates and Plato. That's what you learn. And these guys can argue either side of an issue. And usually Socrates has a fall guy, and that's the name of the dialogue. The person who he's asking questions to and ultimately demolishes. So am I right? That's about the way the dialogue's going? Yeah? So they're not so frightening, are they? Once you've looked at them, actually they're quite interesting, aren't they? Get boring, but you know, you've read 4 or 5, you've basically read them all, but still, I mean, they're not something you can't handle, are they? Most people go, oh, I can't read Socrates, right? But no, you can, yeah. Why am I saying this? Because this book is presented in the form of a Socratic dialogue, yeah.
Why are you not including Aristotle?
Because he didn't write dialogue. And we're talking about, I'm trying to relate it to the Bhagavad Gita. I'm not giving a lecture on Greek philosophy, though it may seem I am. I'm talking about the Bhagavad Gita and its influence. So, you see, those things are written in the form of a dialogue, and so is this. So is this. And it looks to me like it's influenced by those. I may be wrong. It could be independent, but I think it definitely is some influence going on there. And so this thing emerges in the middle of an epic poem. And who are the chief characters in it? I didn't finish my Socrates and Plato. Let me just finish that first before we get into here. So Plato comes along after Socrates' death, very angry about that, and he really gets back at Athenian society by writing all these dialogues. He's really angry that his master has been put to death, and he really eulogizes him, and almost presents him as not a god, but Superman. You know, he's not a superhuman man, but he's a Superman, and that he's so intellectually above everybody else, and he demolishes all other people that, you know, you're totally awed by. He even presents his death in a dialogue called the Phaedo, where he talks about the soul and immortality. And he got into that dialogue called the Phaedo, because he's talking to a guy called Phaedo before he's about to drink the hemlock. That's the pretense. He's talking to Phaedo, and they talk about the soul. And Socrates gives his final lecture, like Jesus in the scripture, on what's going to happen to the soul after death. And he speaks about how philosophers practice dying. We get our whole idea of the mortification of the flesh and the releasing of the soul in Western thought from these dialogues. The whole idea that the body is evil that goes into Christianity. Wasn't in Judaism, by the way. Not to the extent that it is in Christianity. Because these have already come in from the Hellenistic world of Greek philosophical thought. That the body is evil, that you have all these sins, that you must mortify your desires, control your desires in order to do what? Release the soul. That's all from Plato and Socrates. Plato is not really, and Socrates, they're not really philosophical people at all. They're religious philosophical men. And Socrates is like a guru. In any case, he lectures on that. And so he says, what he means that you mortify the flesh and your appetites, as Socrates and Plato call them, your desires, all the things that make you an unruly person, your diet, everything else. As Christian sainthood developed, that went right into Christian sainthood. The Christian saint mortifies his flesh, stops eating, fasts, does things like that, becomes emaciated and skinny, stops having sex, because all these things are appetites. And if you mortify that, you're going a long way to doing what? Releasing the soul. That's where all these ideas originated in the West, but they're also in this book too. The two books are kind of parallel, and I don't think either of them are true. I think they're good disciplines, and they help you diet maybe, and live a more regular life, and get some order out of chaos, and maybe make you a healthier person because you just don't give way to all your, eating Twinkies all day long, or potato chips or something. And you kind of learn how to curb yourself to some extent. As Plato constantly said, the way the soul should be arranged is you should have temperance. Everything should be in moderation. So they do help in that regard. But in this lecture, Socrates is finally pictured as giving in Plato. He starts talking about the transmigration of the soul. That there is transmigration of souls. Well, that's exactly what you have in this book here. So there's a strong correspondence between the civilization we're getting in Greece and the West and what's appearing in books like this, at least in places like India. You often call it Indo-European civilization. So unless you think it's totally unrelated, I think it probably is not unrelated. How do the ideas go back and forth? Something I think of the way I said. Not only Alexander, but a lot of the things that Alexander releases probably already going on to some extent beneath the surface, but he just moves them forward in a more energetic fashion. When did Alexander live? 300 BC. About a century after Socrates and Plato, and you were talking about Aristotle. Aristotle is a student of Plato. They didn't really get along very, very well. And when Aristotle was forced to flee Athens, he said, Athens has killed one philosopher, not going to kill two. And he took off and went to Alexander's father's court and became Alexander's father's tutor. He became the tutor of Alexander and the father of Alexander's court, and that's why Alexander was probably such a crazy person. He had a tutor like Aristotle who filled him full of huge, big ideas, and he was a pretty tough guy, obviously. But what he did with the ideas is kind of like insane. But in any case, partly Plato and Socrates, Aristotle are responsible for Alexander. Not totally. Homer is a little bit responsible too, because Alexander used to sleep with Homer under his pillow. He thought he cooked the myths and the gods, the story of the Iliad, the Trojan War, Achilles, seriously. And he thought he was the second Achilles too. So he was terribly influenced by all this currents of literature and thought coming into it. Poor guy died when he was 33 years old, so he didn't get a very long life out of it, but when he blazed across things in a 10 or 15 year period, he really burned pretty hot. So we're seeing that in the movies now. But to go over to this book, so it's arranged in the form of a dialogue between who?
Arjuna and Krishna.
Arjuna and Krishna. Okay. And basically, who's the teacher, who's the student?
Krishna is the teacher.
Yeah, Krishna is the teacher. He's the Socrates. And Arjuna basically is the Dumbo, the person asking all of the questions. It's a little bit like Castaneda and Don Juan, right? Arjuna is the Castaneda, Krishna is the Don Juan. That's a similar thing. It's the same method. And I know you say, oh, well, you're reducing everything to capitalism. Yeah, I think most things are rip-offs of something else. I think people get ideas from other people and so on and so forth. And then they spin it in their own way. Some can do it better than others, some do it worse than others. You say, well, so the first one you're always emphasizing, yeah, because the first one is usually the thing that starts the whole progression children. So you don't get dialogues earlier than Plato, to my knowledge. Plato starts with the thing going. I was thinking about law schools. They study these things in law schools so that you can argue both sides of the question, and basically you use the Socratic dialectic method to elicit information from either your witnesses or your opponents, to either make them fall on their own swords or get enough information to make them look silly. And that's why people in law school read Plato. It's Law 101. And if you know Plato and how that works, you probably can be a very successful court lawyer right from the get-go. So if any of you are interested in law, you better go read your Plato, and you might be well on your way to a pretty good performance. So here, I don't think this is very well done compared to the Plato stuff. It's not badly done, but you think that there's a progression going on here, but it's more like Socrates and Plato in a sense. It's lectures on the same subjects, just like a snowball rolling down a hill. You're just getting more snow, but you're not getting really a development of ideas. You follow me? So it even may not all be written by the same person. It looks like a series of sermons almost, put in dialogue form. And, after the first 10 or 15, or 10 or 11, let's say, someone else might have added a few of their own. They say, well, I got something to say about this subject. I got the same ideas, but I want to put my spin on it. So they have a different, well, it's called, I don't know what they call it here, part one or book one or chapter one. But it's called a different section. But in fact, it's just a new lecture. And going over the same stuff. So if you read the first 10 chapters of this, basically you've read it all, haven't you? Probably if you've read the first 5. There's nothing much new develops, although the understanding is deeper and deeper. So you're not going, we tend to think of things going in an upward progression, but in this you're not really going in an upward progression. You're just sort of slowly, snowballing outwards. But the core center is always the same. And the people are just adding material onto the core center. Not like the Gospels, where you tell a story or something, in between having debates, Socratic question and answering of Jesus as he goes from place to place. But he goes from place to place and ultimately to his death. But in between, he has these little arguments and debates with different people over certain issues, right? So you get the debating scenario in the Gospels too, but they tell a story. This Bhagavad Gita doesn't tell any story. It starts by telling a story and then it just dies. You get a freeze frame and you're nowhere. Let me just look at one or two more things before we go into the actual book itself. In my introduction, the main story of the Mahabharata, I think it's Roman numeral 21 in some of your books. I'm not sure if they haven't changed it, because each new edition changes it somewhat. Centers around the good and evil, represented on the whole by the Pandavas and the Kauravas. You don't need to know all this. The father of Dhritarashtra, and I read it to you because I can't remember any of it myself. You said, what's it said here? I really wouldn't know. That's why I let you bring your books in again, because if you need to put any of this stuff in there, well, you can refer to it. And Pandu was king of Hastinapura. So none of this makes any sense to me in terms of memorability. At his death, Pandu succeeded to the throne, but his eldest brother Drishtarashtra was blind. And Drishtarashtra had he was blind, but he had a lot of children. My God, I don't know what he was doing there. Drishtarashtra had 100 sons, and the eldest was Duryodhana, the incarnation of evil. Okay, that's the background. The Pandavas became great warriors, and Drishtarashtra appointed his eldest Yudhishthira as heir apparent. And a great rivalry grew up. I don't know who was rivaling who, but a great war broke out, civil war. Mahabharata has 18 books, and the great battle where the Duryodhana and all the armies were destroyed lasted 18 days. It's a kind of ceremonial war, therefore. And against the background of this war, Krishna and Arjuna come into play. So, I don't know, there's some more stuff here about what Krishna and Arjuna represent. And my introduction, is it the same as yours or different? Different, it's a different one. But you can read your one, it doesn't really matter whose introduction you are actually reading. Let me just say one last thing as far as these different kinds of things. I don't want to read all my introduction to you, or you can read yours. Karma. There's two kinds of yoga as will emerge from this book. One called jhana, and the other called karma yoga. They're both yogas. There's lots of other yogas too, but these are the main ones. And for instance, jhana yoga, karma yoga are discussed in the Bhagavad Gita, and maybe we should know a little bit. The meaning has to be considered in reading the Bhagavad Gita. Karma means action or work. And it is often contrasted in the Bhagavad Gita with jhana, which means contemplation or meditative sort of contemplation. So one has to do karma with activity. I don't know how that relates to people saying my karma is such and such. Frankly, it isn't exactly the same thing as the way people popularly use the word when we speak, and people who think that they're following these disciplines, they speak about their karma as a kind of destiny. But in the way the Bhagavad Gita is talking about these things, you should know that jhana is sort of meditation, spiritual, intellectual activity and insight. Karma is basically being active, doing your job, work and activity in this world. So let's see how these things are presented to you. On the field, Drishtarashtra, now we know who he is a little bit, of truth. If your translation differs from mine, I think I have another one here, I could maybe go over that one, but I like the one I'm using. That's on the field of truth, on the battlefield of life. I think these are basically the same still. Not the way yours reads. It's always good to have another one besides the ones we have, even 2 or 3 others, because you'll find that, as I said, the words that are translated here are really not the real meaning sometimes of the original word in Sanskrit. The editor here is a Christian priest, Catholic as usual, and I said mostly Catholic intellectuals did take to this material in our environment, more to Buddhism than this, but also to this. So he is going to translate some things like love, which don't think is really in here, in terms of what a Christian would think love means. things of that kind of things of that kind are a little bit skewed. There's a spin there. On the field of truth, in the battlefield of life, what came to pass, Sanjaya, when my sons and their warriors faced those of my brother Pandu? So basically it's two family lines, Pandu and Drishtarashtra, and Drishtarashtra's sons are fighting Pandu's sons in a civil war. And this is like an epic of that. And who's Sanjaya? Does he play a part in the story? Not really. Who is he? He's the storyteller. So this is really still dialogue, but it's not really, it's a dialogue within a dialogue. This is just the beginning, but it has no bearing on the rest. He's basically the poet telling the court person who he's singing to or entertaining this story. But he will drop out, both of these people will drop out in favor of the next two characters who are in the story. Is that fair? So it's basically a story within a story. So the outer story is being told by Sanjaya to this king called Drishtarashtra. He's not really even a god. So when your son Dhyana, or however you want to pronounce that, saw the armies of the sons of Pandu, he went to ask for the art of war. And he asked them to do some things, and they have banners, and you get the name of all these warriors. It's a little like the Homeric epic. We see the heroic king of Kasi and Purajit the conqueror, and everyone's being named here, and victorious Yudhamana, etc., 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 and Sutama, the son of Arjuna, and so on and so forth. And there is yourself, my master in war, and also Bhishma, and there is Karna, the enemy of Arjuna, and his half-brother Kripa, and so on and so forth. So these people are lined up in a battlefield. So to encourage line 12, Dhyana, Bhishma, the glorious old warrior, sounded loud his war cry and blew his far-sounding conch shell. What's a conch shell? It's one of these things you gather on the beach, like beach. I think it's what like scallops are taken from. That probably is not quite like that, but similar to a scallop shell. What? It's big like snail shell, yeah. And it's like when you take the creature out and you can lift it up and you can blow it like the Jews blow their shofar, for instance. They blow ram's horns. In India, because more beaches probably with more shells on them, they blew conch shells. Didn't have maybe metal work yet that they could get trumpets and tubas and sousaphones and stuff that you see in your modern bands marching around, which are just basically big conch shells made out of metal with mouthpieces. So they blew these kinds of, shofar is basically just a trumpet, isn't it? And underdeveloped trumpet, and not quite as nicely rounded and everything. And the ram's horn in it. And then, so they always blow these seashells. You always see pictures of Krishna blowing seashells. Then the rumbling of war drums, the stirring sound of cymbals and trumpets. Doesn't sound very good to me. And the roaring of the conch shells and horns filled the sky with a fearful thunder. The clatter of armies. I guess that's good. I mean, armies do like a lot of noise, like baboons and hyenas and things, right before they're about to fight each other. Back in those days, not now. Because in those days it was hand-to-hand individual warfare, and basically you made a lot of noise to try to frighten your enemy and get your spirit up. So basically started yelling. It's more like a football game where you have cheerleaders because they're getting the spirit up, getting the crowd worked up, and they're all yelling and shrieking, and the players come out, high five, and that's how the old battles were, except they killed each other. And the more glory it got, I think the more excited people got, because in order to face all that horrible activity, you really had to have your spirits pretty high, or you were going to be dead. I mean, you couldn't go in being depressed, because some other guy is like out of his mind, and he's going to just slaughter you lickety-split. So either you got your spirits worked up and you made a lot of noise and stuff, or you were dead. You probably were dead anyway, but pretty gruesome period. Now we snipe at people with long-range sniper rifles, and then we have helicopters that have little missiles that take out buildings. and it's all like computer game stuff. You don't even have to see any of it. You just like you press a button, it's on your little screen there, and it evaporates. So you can be very quiet and calm. You can even be a yogi and do this. In fact, that's why so much computer stuff is being exported to India. Because, you know, they learn how to be calm and use their mind and sit and think and contemplate and stuff like that. So, yeah. So, it's all changed. But so this isn't so unrealistic, even though it strikes us as insane. So, so here they are, all making a lot of noise. And the whole sky is roaring with thunder, you know. You ever been watching some of those recent epics on the History and other channels about Napoleon? Public television, and they show how he fights his battles, and originally like Waterloo and all those battles, I mean the noise would have been terrible because of the artillery. It always start off with the artillery going, and the Civil War battles were the same, and they all speak about the noise and the smell and so on these battlefields, which is horrific. Even Iwo Jima they described like that, contemporary more recently, but the noise and so on is always horrific, even up to the time of artillery. So that really was something of what battles used to be like, and to some extent may still be. But okay, all this is going on, the sky filled with fearful thunder, and suddenly Krishna, here he is introduced, of Madhava, I guess that's his hometown, and Arjuna, the son of Pandu, stand in their glorious chariot drawn by white horses, answering the challenge, and blew their divine conch shells. Well, this work doesn't impress right from the get-go, does it? And it's not something you're going to pick up any faster than you pick up a Superman comics. Probably you'll pick one of those, you know, have you ever been in a Japanese restaurant where they're all reading comic books, not comic papers, but they're all bound in book form, and everyone's reading everything in the form of a comic book? Probably those comic books are even more impressive than this, but this is the cultural heritage that we're dealing with, and it's outlasted a lot of other stuff, so I mean there is some benefit, but the scene here is not going to impress you. So if this is what their war was like, no wonder they all lost. It's going to go around blowing conch shells and expect to get anywhere, I wouldn't think. So I hope it was a little more warlike and ferocious than this, because Alexander and I would have had easy time with all this. And he did have pretty, not an easy time, but you know, he could go wherever he wanted with his troops, and he didn't have any a supply line. He cut loose from his supply line, and he only had one or two bad times where he ran into some trouble. It'll be in the movie, I'm sure. But you know, he just cut through all these people with a well-trained force, almost like nothing. The way Bush thought he was going to go to Baghdad, I think, which got to Baghdad, but he forgot about the terrorism afterwards. And I think Alexander forgot that too, because he didn't stay in India long. So slowly his army deteriorated through disease, sniping, terrorism, guerrilla type tactics. That's how you defeat a big army that comes in. You let it come in. And I think all this was planned by Saddam anyway. He just got captured. This is what he was going to do in the first place. Let them all come in and then depend on the American public to get fed up as it reads the lurid headlines every single day. That was his battle plan. That's what they're doing. But Alexander didn't have any trouble with these armies. Okay. So Krishna, the Lord of the soul, blew his conch shell. He blows conch shells. Arjuna, the winner of treasure. So these are all titles and so. So the heroics on Arjuna sounded from all sides, their supporters, their conch shells, and the earth and the heavens trembled. The flights of arrows now began. That sounds about realistic. Arjuna, on whose banner was a symbol of an ape. So Arjuna had a flag with a monkey on it. I'm purposely reducing this to laughter in some ways because I don't think it's that serious, and I don't want you to think that we think it's that serious. So, drive my chariot, Krishna immortal, and place it between the two armies, that I may see those warriors who stand there eager for battle, with whom I must now fight at the beginning of the war, that I may see those who have come here eager and ready to fight. Sanjaya, the narrator, takes over. Krishna heard the words of Arjuna. He drove the glorious chariot, placed it between the two armies. And then Arjuna saw both armies, wives, grandfathers, grandsons, fire, were setting the stage for what? The great debate. Because what's going to happen now? The war is going to evaporate. The armies are going to evaporate. We get into freeze frames. Who's freeze framed? Krishna and Arjuna are sitting in the middle of the battle having an argument whether Arjuna should fight. What does that hark back to? Again, have you read your Trojan War? How many read the Trojan War? What's that sound like? Who has to be convinced to fight? Achilles. He's sulking in his tent. It's a little different story. He's sulking in his tent because why? His little concubine has been taken away by the big honcho of the army, and he won't fight until the honcho gives him back his concubine. I mean, that's realistic. I mean, I think that's probably the way men acted. You took my, whatever you want to refer to her as. I don't want to be feminist or chauvinist about this, so I don't want to give anything. You took whatever it is I felt was my due and my right, and you took it. And now I'm sitting here, so I'm going to fight until you give her back, and you can't win without me. Some football players and basketball players act like that. Even today, don't they? So I don't want to get into who we might be talking about in these kinds of scenarios, but they get sort of nasty about their playing time and things like that. And they're not going to play until they're treated right by the owners or the managers. That's typical masculine. I suppose it's feminine too. I mean, I don't know. I haven't been in any of these women basketball or soccer sort of environments, so I really can't speak about that. They don't get publicized as much. So, he drives into the middle of the field, sees all his relatives and so on, and when Arjuna thus saw his kinsmen face to face in both lines of battle, his friends, companions, brothers, he was overcome by grief, despair, and his heart sank. Okay? So, that's the narrator tells us. And then Arjuna picks up the theme. When I see my kinsmen, Krishna, who have come here on this field of battle, life goes from my limbs and I'm unable to fight. My mouth becomes dry, trembling overcomes my body. My great bow, it even has a name like Excalibur and the Sword of Arthur. Gandiva falls from my hands. Arjuna is a bowman. How can I have glory if I kill my own kinsmen? I have no wish for victory. I don't get any benefit of this. I don't want a kingdom. I don't want to slay anyone, 35. Even if I myself am slain. You know, so all this warfare destroys the family, the rituals. Disorder prevails. Women sin and become impure. Disorder carries down, here he says, to hell, but it's not really to hell, and they're down to a bad situation in the family. There's dead spirits suffer, and this horrible hell or world or end is waiting for all of us, a kind of darkness with evil reigning everywhere. And better if, indeed, the sons of Dhritarashtra found me unarmed. Here's the non-resistance to evil of the New Testament. And killed me in the struggle of war. Then spoke Arjuna on the field of battle, letting fall his bow and arrows. Thus spoke Arjuna, and he sank down in deep grief. Chapter 2. We'll just finish this, and I'll let you go in a minute. Whence this lifeless dejection, Arjuna, in this hour of trial? Strong men know not despair. This neither wins heaven or earth. I don't think this would be the original language, but it's an attempt. Throw off ignoble discouragement and ride like a fire that burns all before it. What's going to happen here? Is Krishna a pacifist teacher? In a way, yes, but actually no. What does he want Arjuna to do? Fight, but there's no really any war anymore, is there here? It's a philosophical fight that is going on. So yes, fight. Why must he fight, as we'll find out? because that's his duty in life. That's his position in the caste system. He's a warrior, and warriors fight. And if he doesn't fight, he's not doing what he is obliged to do by his status in the society. That sounds corny, but then it goes further than that. And it encourages you to do your duty. Whether you're a street sweeper, whether you're president, whatever you are. And then it explains to you how to do your duty in a concentrated, disciplined, and totally focused manner. And that's where the yoga comes in. We'll pick up there next time. Thanks for bearing with my poor attempt to enlighten you.
What are these?